Richard was the head of one of the biggest retail chains in the country. From the outside, his life looked perfect. He had wealth, respect, and a corner office at the top of a tall glass building. But behind the polished image, something kept bothering him. For years, he had been hearing about how difficult life was for people working at the lower levels of his company. Some managers reported problems. Customer complaints came in and employee surveys showed frustration. But Richard wanted to see it for himself. Sitting behind a desk reading reports wasn't enough. He wanted to know the truth about how his people were living, what struggles they faced, and how the company was really treating them. That thought grew inside him until one day, he made a bold decision. He would step out of his office, leave the luxury suits behind, and go undercover. No one would know he was the CEO. He would blend in as an ordinary new employee, wearing simple jeans and an old shirt, just another face among the staff. Only a few people at the very top knew what he was planning. The idea excited him, but it also scared him. He had not done regular physical work in years. He was used to meetings, conferences, and decisions that involved millions of dollars. Now he was preparing himself to stand on his feet for hours, stack boxes, clean shelves, and deal with customers who didn't know who he really was. Still, he wanted to do it. He felt a strong need to see the human side of his business again. On his first day as the new guy, Richard walked into one of the busiest stores in the chain. The sun had just risen, and the parking lot was filling up with employees arriving for their morning shift. He wore an old baseball cap pulled low so no one would recognize him. He carried a small backpack and walked nervously toward the staff entrance. For the first time in years, no one opened the door for him or called him sir. He was just another worker reporting for duty. Inside, the manager gave him a quick introduction. Richard pretended to be quiet and shy, keeping his answers short so he wouldn't slip and reveal his real background. He said he was looking for work, needed a steady paycheck, and was happy to start anywhere. The manager nodded and handed him an apron. His first job would be in the stockroom, unpacking deliveries and putting products on the shelves. The moment he stepped into the stockroom, Richard felt the difference. The air was warmer, the shelves taller than he remembered, and the boxes heavier than he expected. He saw workers moving quickly, lifting, bending, and trying to keep pace with the constant flow of goods. Sweat ran down his back after only 30 minutes. His arms ached from carrying cartons. He realized right away that this was not easy work. As the hours passed, he began to notice the small details. Some workers laughed and encouraged each other, but others moved in silence with tired eyes. He saw how strict the time clocks were, how short the breaks were, and how little room there was for mistakes. When customers asked for help, the workers had to smile, even if they were exhausted. Richard listened carefully to conversations around him. He heard people talking about second jobs, about babysitters they could hardly afford, about bills piling up. A young man complained that his paycheck never stretched far enough, and a woman whispered to another that she had skipped lunch again to save money. Richard's heart grew heavy. These were the people who kept his company alive every day, yet many of them were struggling just to survive. At the front of the store, he was assigned to shadow a cashier for part of the day. The line of customers was endless, and the cashier had to move quickly, scanning items, bagging them, answering questions, all while keeping a polite smile. Richard admired her patience, but he could see the tiredness in her eyes. By the time the shift ended, he felt drained, his legs sore, his back aching. He wondered how the employees did this every single day, sometimes for 10 or 12 hours straight. When the staff gathered for a quick break, Richard sat quietly with them. He ate a simple sandwich he had packed and listened as the others talked. That's when he noticed one young woman who seemed different. She kept to herself, speaking softly only when asked something. She looked weary, like she hadn't slept well in days. But what struck Richard most was the way she kept checking her phone, as if worried about something outside the store. Richard couldn't place it yet, but something about her caught his attention. She wasn't like the others who laughed or shared stories. She stayed quiet, her eyes carrying a sadness he couldn't ignore. That first day ended with Richard walking back to the parking lot with the rest of the workers. He was exhausted, his clothes sticky with sweat, his muscles sore. As he got into his car, he noticed the same young woman again. She was walking slowly to her own car, an older vehicle with a blanket hanging over the window. She opened the door carefully, glanced around nervously, and then sat inside. Richard thought it was strange, but he didn't want to intrude. He drove away, but the image stayed in his mind. At home that night, Richard lay in bed thinking about everything he had seen. The reality of his employees' lives was far harsher than he had imagined. Reports and spreadsheets had never shown him this side of the story. He had felt their exhaustion, heard their worries, and seen the weight they carried. And that young woman, something told him her story was deeper than what he had glimpsed. He promised himself he would pay closer attention the next day. As he closed his eyes, Richard realized this undercover journey was already changing him. For the first time in years, he felt connected to the people who built his company from the ground up. He felt their struggles, their sacrifices, and their quiet strength. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of something that would alter not only his life, but the life of someone he had just met. The next morning, Richard arrived at the store earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen and the parking lot was still half empty. He wanted to experience what the employees went through before the doors opened for customers. The air was cold and he pulled his jacket tighter as he walked toward the staff entrance. Inside, the store felt quiet, almost sleepy, with only a few workers moving around, preparing the aisles and restocking shelves. Richard was assigned once again to help in the stockroom, lifting boxes and arranging items on carts. His body still ached from the previous day, but he didn't complain. He kept his focus, reminding himself that this was only a glimpse into the lives his workers lived every single day. After about an hour, he noticed the same young woman he had seen the day before. She came in quietly, her head slightly down, holding a small bag that looked worn from use. Her uniform was neatly pressed, but her eyes seemed heavier, as if she hadn't slept well. She greeted no one, just gave a faint smile to the manager and walked straight to her counter. Richard couldn't shake the memory of seeing her in that old car the night before. Something about it didn't sit right with him. Why had she been sitting there so long? Why was there a blanket covering the window? He felt a tug of curiosity, but more than that, a tug of concern. Throughout the morning, he found himself watching her more closely, though he tried not to make it obvious. She worked hard and fast, never wasting a moment. When customers asked her questions, she answered politely, but there was a tiredness in her tone, like every word cost her energy. Richard admired her determination, but it also broke his heart. At one point during a short break, Richard saw her step outside. Instead of joining the others in the break room, she walked toward the parking lot. Curious, he quietly followed from a distance. She opened the same old car he had noticed before, and this time, Richard's eyes widened. Inside, wrapped in a small blanket, was a baby. The young woman lifted the baby gently, cradling it in her arms, and began rocking it softly. The child let out a small cry and she quickly soothed it, whispering words Richard couldn't hear. She pulled out a bottle, warmed slightly by a small portable heater plugged into her car, and began feeding the baby. Richard froze. He had never imagined this. One of his employees, working full-time at his company, was living out of a car with a baby. He stood there quietly, hidden behind another vehicle, his heart pounding. It was one thing to hear about employees struggling. It was another to see it with his own eyes. After a few minutes, the young woman carefully placed the baby back on the seat, covering it with blankets to keep it warm. She checked the windows, making sure no one could see inside, and then headed back to the store as if nothing had happened. Richard couldn't focus on anything for the rest of his shift. The image of that small baby bundled up in the back seat of an old car stayed with him. He had built his company to provide jobs, but what good was it if someone working under him couldn't even afford a safe place to live? Later that day, when he had the chance, he approached her casually, still pretending to be just another new worker. "You okay?" he asked softly, not wanting to seem intrusive. She hesitated, looking at him as though deciding whether or not to answer. Finally, she nodded. "I'm fine," she said with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Richard didn't push further, but something in her expression told him she wasn't fine at all. He noticed how protective she became whenever anyone mentioned family or home. It was like she had built a wall around herself, letting no one see what was really happening. The day dragged on, and when their shift finally ended, Richard again lingered in the parking lot, pretending to check his phone. He watched her walk slowly to the car, her shoulders slumped. She looked around carefully, making sure no one was watching, and then slipped inside. Richard's chest tightened when he saw her check on the baby again. Driving home that night, Richard felt torn. He wanted to help her right away, but he was still undercover. If he revealed himself too soon, the entire purpose of his mission would be lost. He needed to find a way to understand her situation better without breaking her trust. Over the next few days, he made small efforts to talk to her during breaks. He asked simple questions. If she had family nearby, how long she had worked at the store, what her schedule was like. At first, she kept her answers short, almost guarded. But slowly, she began to open up, though never completely. She mentioned that she had been at the store for about a year. She said she worked as many hours as possible, but still found it difficult to cover all her expenses. Richard could see the pain in her eyes whenever the topic of home came up, so he didn't push further. He didn't want her to retreat back into silence. One evening, as the sun was setting and the parking lot emptied, Richard stayed behind, pretending he had extra tasks. He saw her head to the car again. This time he walked a little closer, careful not to startle her. When she noticed him standing nearby, she froze for a moment. Richard gave her a gentle smile. "Is that your little one?" he asked softly, glancing toward the back seat where he could see the outline of the baby blanket. For a second, she looked like she might deny it. But then her shoulders dropped and she sighed. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "It's just me and her." Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her right then and there who he really was, to promise her she would never have to struggle like this again. But instead he just nodded, trying to keep his cover. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The young woman smiled faintly, the first real smile he had seen from her. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she turned her eyes back to the car as if afraid he might judge her. Richard shook his head gently. "Don't worry," he said. "You're doing an amazing job, more than most people could." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then she whispered almost too softly to hear. "It's hard, but I don't have a choice." Richard didn't push for more. He just nodded, his heart aching with every word she spoke. That night, as he drove home, he could barely see the road through the thoughts racing in his mind. He had gone undercover to understand his workers' struggles, but he had never expected to uncover something this heartbreaking. One of his employees was living in a car with her baby. She worked long hours, smiled through her exhaustion, and carried a weight that would have crushed most people, and no one knew. Richard knew he couldn't stay silent. Something had to change, and he was the one who had the power to make it happen. The next day, Richard arrived at the store with a heavy heart. He had barely slept the night before, replaying the moment in the parking lot over and over again in his mind. The picture of that baby wrapped in blankets inside an old car wouldn't leave him. It stirred something deep inside him, anger, sadness, but also a strong determination to do something about it. But before taking any step, he wanted to hear her full story. He wanted her to trust him enough to open up completely. The morning shift began as usual. Employees rushed around preparing shelves, helping customers, and stocking items. Richard tried to act like everything was normal, but his eyes often wandered toward the young woman. She moved quickly, working with precision, never complaining even when a customer was rude or when she had to stand for hours. She was careful to hide her struggles from everyone else, but Richard could see the weight she carried. During the lunch break, instead of sitting alone like he usually did, Richard walked over to her table in the break room. He carried his sandwich and asked, "Mind if I sit here?" She looked up a little surprised, but then nodded. "Sure," she said softly. For a few minutes, they ate in silence. Richard didn't want to rush her. Then he said gently, "You work really hard. I've noticed. Not many people could handle what you do every day." Her eyes lowered to the table. "I just do what I have to do," she replied. Richard hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "I hope you don't mind me asking, how do you manage everything? Working so many hours and, well, raising a baby too?" Her hand froze on her sandwich. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him carefully as if trying to measure whether he was safe to talk to. Finally, she sighed. "I don't really manage," she whispered. "I just survive." Richard's chest tightened. He didn't speak, just let her continue if she wanted to. She looked around the room, making sure no one else was listening. Then she said quietly, "I used to rent an apartment, but when rent went up, I couldn't keep up. After paying for food, diapers, and everything else, I had nothing left. I tried getting another job, but I couldn't leave my baby alone that long. And daycare costs more than I make in a day." She stopped for a moment, swallowing hard. "So when I couldn't pay the rent anymore, we had to leave." I didn't have anywhere else to go. I've been staying in the car ever since. Richard listened without interrupting. Every word cut deep. He could see how hard it was for her to say these things out loud. She continued, her voice trembling. It's not safe. I hardly sleep at night because I keep checking if she's okay if anyone's near the car. When it gets too cold, I just hold her close and pray the blankets are enough. Sometimes I think I'm failing her, but what else can I do? I come here every day, I work as much as they give me, and I still can't give her a proper home. By now her eyes were glistening, and she quickly wiped them with the back of her hand, embarrassed. Sorry, she muttered. I don't usually tell people. I don't want anyone to think I can't handle it. Richard's throat felt tight. He wanted to reach across the table and reassure her, tell her she wasn't failing at all, that she was stronger than most people he had ever met. But he kept his voice calm. You don't need to apologize. You're doing more than anyone could expect. Raising a child while working like this, that's strength, not weakness. For the first time, she looked at him with a little relief, as if his words had lifted a small piece of the burden she carried. The rest of the day, Richard kept thinking about that conversation. Her honesty had shaken him. He had read reports about employee hardships before, but hearing it directly, seeing her tears made it real in a way numbers never could. He knew he couldn't just walk away from this. That evening he waited until most of the workers had left. Then he walked with her again toward the parking lot. She opened the car door and the baby stirred. Richard stood nearby quietly watching until she noticed him. You shouldn't be out here, she said softly, looking embarrassed again. Richard shook his head. I just wanted to tell you, you're not alone, even if it feels like it. She looked at him, unsure what to say. Then she whispered, I've been alone for a long time. He didn't push further. He just nodded, then wished her good night and walked to his own car. But as he drove home, his heart pounded. Every instinct inside him told him it was time to act. The next day, Richard arranged to work on the same shift again. He stayed close, helping her at the counter, carrying boxes when needed, trying to ease her load in small ways. Customers came and went, and though her face stayed polite, Richard could see the exhaustion in her eyes. At one point, when the store grew quiet, Richard leaned closer and said, I know you don't know me well, but I want you to believe me when I say this. You deserve better. You and your baby both. She blinked at him, startled. Then she gave a tiny smile, almost sad. Better doesn't happen for people like me, she whispered. We just keep going and hope something changes. Those words hit Richard like a stone. She had stopped expecting good things for herself. She was living in survival mode, just fighting to make it through each day. He knew right then that when the time came for him to reveal who he really was, he would prove her wrong. That night, as he sat in his office at home, Richard wrote down everything he had seen and heard. He made notes about the working conditions, the struggles, and most importantly about her situation. His undercover journey was supposed to give him insights into his company, but it had become something much bigger. It was no longer just about improving business, it was about saving lives, starting with hers. He thought about the baby again, lying in the back seat of that car, relying completely on a mother who was doing her very best against impossible odds. And he knew deep in his heart that soon he would have to step out of the shadows. He couldn't stay undercover much longer, not when he had the power to change everything for her. For now, though, he would stay quiet a little longer, listening, learning, and waiting for the right moment. But inside, a storm was building. He had gone undercover to learn. Instead, he had found a story that would change him forever. The week went by slowly, and Richard felt the weight of every passing day. He was carrying a secret that no one in the store could even imagine. To the staff, he was just another quiet new worker trying to learn the ropes. But deep inside, he knew the moment was coming when he could no longer pretend. He had seen enough, he had heard enough, and now it was time to do something. On the morning of the big reveal, Richard dressed differently. He still wore simple clothes, but this time he stood a little straighter, with the confidence of a man who knew what he was about to do. As he drove to the store, he replayed the faces of all the employees in his mind. The man who worked 2 shifts just to pay bills. The older woman who had arthritis but still lifted boxes. The young cashier who skipped meals so she could buy diapers. And above all, the young mother with the baby in the car. When he arrived, everything looked the same as usual. Workers bustled about, customers came and went, and the day moved along with its usual routine. Richard went through his shift as if nothing was different, but inside, his heart raced. He knew what was waiting at the end of the day. Finally, when the store closed and the last customers left, the manager called everyone into the break room for a short staff meeting. People gathered slowly, chatting quietly, tired but curious about why the meeting had been scheduled. Richard sat among them, pretending to be just another worker. Then the manager cleared his throat. "Before we finish today, there's someone here who wants to speak with you all." He glanced at Richard knowingly. Richard stood up, his palms slightly sweaty. He looked around the room at the faces staring back at him, faces that had no idea who he really was. Taking a deep breath, he removed the baseball cap he had been wearing since his first day undercover. His voice was calm but firm. "My name isn't what I told you. I haven't been honest about who I am. The truth is, I'm the CEO of this company." For a moment, silence filled the room. People blinked. Some frowned, others laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. But when they saw the serious look on his face, the reality sank in. A wave of shock spread across the room. Whispers erupted. "Did he say CEO? No way. Are you serious?" Richard raised his hand gently to quiet the room. "I came here undercover because I wanted to see with my own eyes what life is really like for the people who make this company run. Reports and numbers only tell part of the story. I wanted to hear your voices, feel the work you do, and understand the challenges you face. And what I've seen has opened my eyes more than I could have ever imagined." The workers sat in stunned silence, their faces a mix of disbelief and curiosity. Richard's eyes scanned the room until they rested on the young mother. She looked frozen, her hand gripping the edge of her chair. He felt his chest tighten but continued. "There's one story in particular that touched me deeply. One of you has been carrying a burden so heavy that most people wouldn't survive a single day of it. Yet she shows up here every morning, works hard, and smiles through the pain. She does it not for herself but for her baby. And no one here knew because she didn't want pity, she just wanted to provide." The young mother's face turned pale. She lowered her head, afraid of what was coming next. Richard took a step closer. "I'm talking about you," he said softly. The room went completely silent. All eyes turned toward her. Some workers gasped, others looked confused. The young mother's lips trembled and tears welled in her eyes. She whispered, almost in shame, "I didn't want anyone to know." Richard knelt slightly so he was at her level. His voice was gentle but strong enough for everyone to hear. "You should never be ashamed. You are stronger than anyone I've met. You're doing everything you can for your child, and that's something to be proud of." She covered her face with her hands, unable to stop the tears. The room remained silent, every worker watching the moment unfold. Richard stood again and looked at the rest of the employees. "This is why I came here, to understand the real struggles you face, and now that I know, I cannot ignore it. Things will change. Starting today," the workers shifted in their seats, listening intently. Richard turned back to the young mother. "You will no longer have to sleep in that car. Starting tonight, we've arranged a safe apartment for you and your baby, paid for by the company for as long as you need to get back on your feet. And that's not all. You will be promoted to a position with higher pay, so you can build a future for yourself and your child without fear." Gasps filled the room. A few employees clapped instinctively. Others wiped their eyes, moved by what they were hearing. The young mother broke down completely, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to say anything. Just know that you are not invisible. You matter. Your child matters, and we will stand with you." The break room filled with emotion. Some workers hugged each other. Some shook their heads in disbelief, and others whispered prayers of thanks. No one had expected this. They had never seen a CEO step down from his office, work beside them, and then reveal such compassion. But Richard wasn't finished. He addressed the entire group again. "This company exists because of you. You are the ones who stand on your feet for hours, who face the customers, who make sure every shelf is stocked. You are the heart of this business. From now on, I promise changes will be made. Not just for one of you, but for all of you. Better pay, better support, and new programs to help anyone struggling with housing or basic needs. You give so much of yourselves. It's time this company gave back." The room erupted into applause, louder this time, filled with both relief and hope. For many, it was the first time they felt truly seen by someone at the very top. The young mother wiped her tears, still in shock. She looked at Richard with gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know what this means for us." Richard smiled gently. "I think I do, and you deserve every bit of it." That night, when the employees left the store, the young mother didn't walk back to her old car. Instead, she was guided to a new beginning. The company had already arranged temporary housing for her, and staff members volunteered to help her move what little she had. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to wonder if her baby would be safe through the night. As Richard watched her step into the apartment with her child in her arms, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: true purpose. It wasn't the profits, the numbers, or the corporate achievements that mattered most. It was this. It was changing lives, giving people hope, and standing beside them in their struggles. The undercover journey had started as a simple idea, but it had turned into something far more powerful. Richard knew that this was only the beginning. His eyes had been opened, and from now on he would never close them again. The news of what happened in the break room spread through the store like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone was talking about it. Some workers still couldn't believe it. Others said they had never seen anything like it in their lives. The young mother arrived with her baby, this time not from the cold seat of an old car, but from the warmth of a small apartment provided by the company. For the first time in months, she had slept peacefully without fear of someone knocking on her window in the middle of the night. Her co-workers greeted her differently now. Instead of quiet glances or polite nods, they gave her smiles, pats on the back, and words of encouragement. "You deserve it," one of them said softly. "We're happy for you." She blushed, unused to the attention, but deep down she felt lighter than she had in a very long time. Richard walked into the store later that day, no longer undercover. This time he wore a simple suit, nothing flashy, but it was enough for everyone to see him as who he really was. The staff looked at him with a mix of respect and disbelief. Some whispered to each other, still trying to connect the man who had carried boxes beside them to the leader of the entire company. He gathered everyone again and spoke with a calm but powerful voice. "I meant every word I said yesterday. This company cannot survive without you. You are the backbone, and I will make sure from now on no one feels invisible or forgotten." He announced a new employee support program that would begin immediately. It included housing assistance for workers facing emergencies, better health benefits, and opportunities for growth within the company. He explained that he had seen the struggles firsthand and would no longer allow them to be ignored. The room filled with applause. For the first time in a long time, the employees felt that someone at the top understood what their lives were really like. But beyond the policies and promises, what touched everyone most was the story of the young mother. She became a symbol of strength and resilience. People admired how she had endured so much without giving up. And they admired Richard for noticing her, for stepping in when it mattered most. Days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere in the store slowly began to change. The workers felt more motivated, more valued. They no longer saw themselves as replaceable parts of a big machine, but as people whose voices mattered. The young mother, now promoted to a better role, carried herself with more confidence. She still faced challenges. Raising a child alone was never easy, but she no longer carried the heavy fear of not knowing where she would sleep at night. One evening, as Richard visited the store again, he saw her at the counter speaking kindly to a customer. There was a brightness in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Later, she came up to him and said, "I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough. You didn't just give me a place to stay, you gave me back my dignity." Richard smiled gently. "You don't owe me thanks. You earned everything. All I did was notice what should have been noticed a long time ago." She shook her head. "No, you listened. And that's what made the difference." Her words stayed with him. Listening. That was something he realized he hadn't done enough of in his years as CEO. He had listened to reports, to numbers, to shareholders, but he hadn't truly listened to the people who worked at the ground level. Now he knew that listening was the most powerful tool a leader could have. Not long after, the story of Richard's undercover journey reached beyond the store. Word spread through the company and then into the media. Reporters covered the story of a CEO who had gone undercover and discovered an employee living in a car with her baby. People across the country were touched by it. Letters and messages poured in, some from other workers who had faced similar struggles, some from strangers who simply wanted to say how inspiring it was. But Richard wasn't looking for fame. He avoided interviews whenever he could. When he did speak, he always shifted the attention back to the employees. "This is not about me," he told one reporter. "This is about them. This is about seeing people for who they are and valuing their humanity. One story opened my eyes, but there are thousands more out there that we still need to hear." Meanwhile, the young mother continued to build her life. With the stability of housing and a better income, she was able to focus more on her baby, who was now smiling more, sleeping better, and thriving in ways she had once only dreamed of. She no longer had to rock her child to sleep in a cold car. She could finally sing lullabies in a warm room, knowing they were safe. Her coworkers often checked in on her, offering to babysit, sharing meals, or just lending an ear when she needed to talk. What had once been a lonely battle had now turned into a community of support. She often thought back to the days when she felt invisible, when she thought no one would ever see her struggles. Now, not only had someone seen her, but that someone had the power to change everything. Richard visited her apartment one evening to see how she was doing. She invited him in, and he saw the baby crawling on the carpet playing with a small toy. The sight filled his heart with warmth. She offered him tea, and they sat together talking not as CEO and employee, but as two human beings. "You know," she said softly, "there were nights I thought I wouldn't make it. Nights I cried quietly so my baby wouldn't hear. And now when I look around, it feels like a different life." Richard nodded. "That's why I want to make sure no one else has to go through what you went through. You've given me a gift too. You've shown me what really matters." The baby let out a small laugh, and both of them smiled. It was a moment of pure humanity, a reminder of why kindness mattered more than profit, why leadership was about people, not just numbers. In the weeks that followed, the company launched its new programs nationwide. Housing assistance funds were created, emergency childcare support was added, and pay structures were reviewed to make them fairer. Employees across the country began to feel a shift, a sense of hope they hadn't felt before, and through it all, Richard often thought back to that first night when he had seen the young mother sitting in her car with her baby. That single moment had changed the course of his life, and the life of his company. For the young mother, her journey was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, but now she faced them with strength, knowing she was no longer alone. She had a roof over her head, a steady income, and a future that looked brighter than ever. For Richard, the lesson was clear. Leadership wasn't about staying in an office high above the ground. It was about stepping down, walking beside the people who carried the company on their shoulders and listening to their stories. It was about seeing them not as workers, but as human beings. And so, what began as an undercover mission ended as a life-changing journey. For one woman, for her child, and for an entire company. A journey that reminded everyone watching that sometimes, the most powerful change starts with simply noticing someone's struggle and choosing not to look away.